We'll all look at Deborah, Barak, and Jael. Those are our three main foci for tonight.
The Israelites, again, did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. After Ehud died, so the Lord sold them into the hand of King Jael of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. The commander of his army was Zerah, who lived in Harosheth HaGoyim.
And the Israelites cried out to the Lord for help, for he, King Jabin, had 900 chariots of iron and had oppressed the Israelites cruelly 20 years.
Great. Let me just throw out this question. Just based on reading this, do you have any clue approximately when this story took place? Just curious. Okay. Yes, right? So there's no dating. There's no 1200 BC, but that's basically when the Iron Age began. And Deborah is supposed to have lived somewhere between 1200 BC and maybe 1050 BC. So somewhere in that 150-year range, she was supposed to have lived and ruled. And it matches perfectly with when the Iron Age began, which was about 1200 BC. This is also why King Jabin and his forces could be so doggone oppressive. Militarily, they were just so much stronger than the Israelites. They had battle gear, they had chariots that the Israelites simply didn't have. It's like a foot soldier versus a tank. One of the nuggets that God gave me after reading about just this intro is simply that even when the Israelites were oppressed by this foreign country, that when they cried out, God heard them. And this is going to be the pattern over and over and over again in Judges. That, the Israelites are suffering, they're really, beyond themselves, and then they cry out to God, and after a period of time, God raises up a judge, delivers them from their oppression, things are good in the land, they're happy again, and then bam, they start forgetting God, they start going back to their old ways, and they're depressed again, and they cry out, and God gives them another judge. This happens 12 times in the book of Judges. And honestly, when I first kind of saw this pattern, I just thought, this is kind of boring. It's like, this just keeps going on and on and on. The only thing that changes are the names of the judges, right? And the enemy, right? So I was like, gosh. But then I realized, actually, if I take a step further back, this is the pattern since the beginning, right? In Exodus, the children of Israel are enslaved, they cry out, God sends them a deliverer, and then before too long, they're right back where they started, only now they're in the desert, right? This happens as you go on through the kings, as you go on through the exile. It just keeps going on. So I realized, wow, actually God is supremely patient, unbelievably kind and forgiving. And thank God that that is who God is. And then also, if any of us happen to be going through a particularly tough time, or we're really feeling kind of oppressed, whether it's because of what's going on around us with the coronavirus or stuff sometimes that gets entangled inside of us, I really appreciated this nugget that God gave me, which is just whenever we're behind enemy lines, we can cry out, and God will hear us. We should never believe the lie, oh man, I messed up too much this time, or I should know better. I didn't just meet God yesterday. Well, sometimes the person who has just met God yesterday is a lot more on fire than we are. But that's okay. Let's not give ourselves almost excuses for denying God the pleasure of rescuing us, of helping us. Amen? So let's take a look at Deborah. What does the Bible tell us about her in chapter 4, verse 4?
Well, just from verse 4, I guess that she's a prophet, that she's married to Lapidus.
Great. Absolutely. Yeah, this was not a trick question. Exactly right on. Yeah, prophetess, wife of Labadoth, and one other thing?
Judge.
And she's a judge. She's actually, we catch her in the midst of judging. She's actually in the office of the judge and doing it. So let's just take that apart. Prophetess. What does it mean for her to be a prophetess?
She hears from God and tells the people what he says.
Absolutely. Nothing short of being God's mouthpiece or spokesperson, right? She hears directly from God, and that's what she delivers. Great. Now, here's where our normal English understanding of judge and what the Hebrew Bible meant by judge is a bit different. Yes, she did adjudicate cases. Okay, so she was a judge in that sense. But that's not where her power stayed. She also was, you could say she had the office of the president. She was the ruler of the 12 tribes. So they were a loose confederation. They weren't exactly a nation yet, which is the only reason we don't call her queen. But she had that kind of authority. She also made the laws. So basically, she's got the executive power, the judicial power, and the legislative power. Another way of saying that is she's the commander-in-chief, she's the Supreme Court, and she's the president. She has all of those powers and exercises all of them. Does Deborah remind you of anyone else? And the only hint I'll give you is verse 5.
She used to sit under the palm of Deborah between Raymond and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites came up to her for judgment.
Great. Does she remind you of anyone else?
Was there another prophet that used to sit in the same area?
Yeah. The next day, Moses sat as judge for the people, while the people stood around him from morning until evening. Favor, did you know that? See that?
She was not using a prophetic.
Thanks for giving us all a chance. Yeah, Moses, this sitting is not just kind of like, oh, she was lounging around. She was sitting in judgment under the palm. And that's exactly what Moses was doing, right? Those are the 10 Commandments, if you can't quite see the sculpture. And that's him also seated. Okay, so it was a position of judgment. She was doing her job. Going back to that verse, anyone else she reminds you of? Yeah, Ramah is his hometown, and Bethel is where he made his annual circuit. So I think he went to Bethel, Mizpah. I'm not sure if it's Gilgal, but that when he was judge, he would go every year to these 3 places. Samuel's the only person I can think of who was both a judge and a prophet. The office he holds that Deborah does not is the office of the priest. However, like Moses, she pronounced curses and blessings. And so Moses, that was one of the priestly duties that he actually exercised. So really, she's quite outstanding.
She sent and summoned Barak, son of Abinoam, from Kadesh in Naphtali, and said to him, "The Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go take position at Mount Tabor, bring in 10,000 from the tribe of Naphtali and the tribe of Zebulun. I will draw out Sisera, the general of Jabin's army, to meet you by the Wadi Kishon with his chariots and his troops, and I will give him into your hand."
Naphtali and Zebulun are 2 of the most northern tribes of Israel. Okay, there are 12 tribes. Those are the 2 northern ones. And then this is the Kishon River. So Barak is supposed to bring down all these soldiers. There's going to be some kind of fight that goes on here, and God's going to pounce the enemy. Okay. Now, we're going to look at Barak's response. Could you read 8 through 10?
Barak said to her, "If you will go with me, I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go." And she said, "I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, the road on which you are going will not lead to your glory, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman." Then Deborah got up and went with Barak to Kadesh. Barak summoned Zebulun and Naphtali to Kadesh, and 10,000 warriors went up behind him, and Deborah went up with him.
Great. So, can someone just summarize briefly what happened between Barak and Deborah?
He didn't want to go without her.
Right. Plain and simple, right? And how does she respond to that? I'll go with you, but you're not going to get the glory. A woman is. And let's not assume that Deborah is saying something that's self-deprecating of womankind. I think she's just being a good prophet. She's telling it like it is. This is what's going to happen. And yet she is willing to go with him. Okay? And I think that becomes very important, as we'll see later. Because Barak, from verse 10, as soon as she goes with him, Deborah, he does everything according to what God said. So, okay, he gives up the glory as long as he knows he's going to win. As long as he knows Israel's going to end up okay, he'll do it. Okay? So there's no more hesitation.
What I'm gleaning from reading this is not only was she a prophetess, a wife, and a judge, she must have also been a warrior. Because if he's saying, I will go if you'll go, I mean, it's not, she must have been able to handle herself and defend herself, so she was not a liability, she was an asset.
Then Deborah said to Barak, Up, for this is the day on which the Lord has given Sisera into your hand. The Lord is indeed going out before you. So Barak went down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 warriors following him. And the Lord threw Sisera and all his chariots and all his army into a panic before Barak. Sisera got down from his chariot and fled away on foot, while Barak pursued the chariots and the army to Harosheth Hagoyim. All the army of Sisera fell by the sword. No one was left.
Right. So Deborah is still prophesying. Now she's prophesying and encouraging, exhorting Barak, go for it. Don't hold back. The Lord is going out before you. So she's not pointing to herself at all. She's pointing to the fact that God's got this. And God is going to do exactly what he told you he would do. And verse 15, the Lord threw Sisera and all his chariots and army into a panic before Barak. What's really interesting is if you get to read chapter 5 of Judges, the way in which God does this is God sends rains, torrential rains, so much so that the river Kishon overflows, and then these chariots, these 900 iron chariots, get caught in the mud, and then it's easy to toss them out of their the soldiers out of the chariots. It's just a whole mess. It's like Hurricane Sandy. You know, so that's why it says God did this. I don't know how much Barak did. I mean, he brought the troops down. He probably did some fighting. Maybe he did the cleanup. But God is clearly the author and finisher of this battle. Yeah. There's one escapee. And who is that? Yeah. So the general gets away.
And what more should I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched raging fire, escaped the edge of the sword, won strength out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight.
Amen. And I think this is a great character sketch of Barak, especially those last couple of lines where it says, some of them are judges, some of them are kings, they won strength out of weakness. I think Barak, more than anyone, fits that description. and became mighty in war. I don't want to take any powers away from him. And he did put a foreign army to flight. So I think to vindicate Barak, if he needs vindication, I feel like his faith grew. And even if he started with very little faith, maybe even shaking in his legs, because he had God's presence and because he had God's favor, and some of that was embodied in Deborah, he was able to grow into the man of God and soldier that won this battle. And I think it says a lot about Deborah too. Imagine you're the mentor, your mentee is quivering, and God has clearly spoken, and that person knows it, not just you, the mentee knows it. And you could just say, chuck it, I'll move on to someone else, more worthy or with a little bit more faith or more responsive to God. But instead, Deborah says, okay, I'll go. And, it turns out enormous for the both of them. And there's more to come on that score. But I just think that's a sign of a mentor whose pride doesn't get in the way of sticking with a disciple, even when that disciple has got clay feet. That is definitely not the time you want to give up on people. Yeah. Okay. Last but not least, let's look at Jael. Okay.
The wife of Kenite,
Uh-huh.
likely an ally of King Jabin, descendant of Moses' father-in-law, and a homemaker.
Yep. So we don't even know if she's an Israelite. She's not a sumo wrestler. The only reason she's got such strength in her arms is because she's been, she does the tents. When they have to set up tent, she hammers the things in. That's typical women's work, actually. It's kind of ironic because it requires so much brute strength. But back in the day, it was women's work.
Now Sisera had fled away on foot to the tent of Jael, wife of Heber the Kenite, for there was peace between King Jabin of Hazor and the clan of Heber the Kenite. Jael came out to meet Sisera and said to him, "Turn aside, my lord, turn aside to me, have no fear." So he turned aside to her into the tent, and she covered him with a rug.
Then he said to her, "Please give me a little water to drink, for I'm thirsty." So she opened a skin of milk and gave him a drink and covered him. He said to her, "Stand at the entrance of the tent, and if anybody comes and asks you, 'Is anyone here?' say no."
But Jael, wife of Heber, took a tent peg and took a hammer in her hand, and went softly to him and drove the peg into his temple, until it went down into the ground. He was lying fast asleep from weariness, and he died. Then, as Barak came in pursuit of Sisera, Jael went out to meet him, and said to him, "Come, and I will show you the man whom you are seeking." So he went into her tent, and there was Sisera lying dead, with the tent peg in his temple.
This is violent. Yes, Caroline.
When you're saying it's violent, and I've read this before, but I didn't realize that the peg was until it went into the ground.
Yeah.
So she was hammered.
I can only imagine, because of just how clear she was about what she needed to do. There's no remorse, there's no hesitation, that she must have somehow heard clearly from God, just as clearly as Deborah and as Barak. I really feel like there are foils going on. So Jael is a homemaker turned avenger. Barak is a man of little faith who becomes a hero of faith, right? He's listed in the hall of faith. Deborah is a woman, which, again, in our day, we have a lot of rights. But back in the day, for her to be a woman and the only judge of all the judges to rise to the top, that says something. She was the most powerful woman in all of Israel. No ifs, ands, or buts. Some commentators, though, raise this question. if Deborah is so powerful and such a great ruler, how come she is not mentioned as a deliverer? And they'll say, in contrast to some of the male judges who were called a deliverer. And the implication or this insinuation is there's something different because she's a woman. And maybe it means that somehow she's less than. This is the implication. I actually heard this preached in a sermon not too long ago, but I certainly have heard this question raised in writings. So, thank God there are other people who study the same passage and have really, also pondered about that question. Because I have to say, I was taken aback. The first thing I did, well, not the first thing, but one of the things I did is I went back to the book of Judges and I scanned every single judge. And there are only 2 judges who are referred to as a deliverer: Othniel and Ehud. Ehud is the left-handed judge. Othniel is Caleb's brother. The whole point of Judges is to point us to the deliverer. And sometimes by leaving the human name out, it drives the point even more clearly that we're not to look to any human being ultimately as our deliverer. We need friends, we need mentors, we need all kinds of people, family, but ultimately the deliverer is God. How she can be so magnificent. In fact, of all the major judges in the book of Judges, all of them have something that sullies their reputation. Samson is a womanizer. Jephthah kills his daughter because he makes this crazy vow, right? And who else? Even Samuel was a bad dad, right? None of the major judges come out sparkling clean, except Deborah. There are no moral blemishes. I'm not saying she's perfect, but there are no blemishes about her character that the scriptures speak of. So she's kind of up there, even in God's eyes. And yet, she's not full of herself.
Then Deborah and Barak, son of Abinoam, sang on that day.
So it was totally kosher at the end of a war, when you're victorious, to have a victory hymn, a victory song. And you would think, especially when God made a point of the fact that the glory was not going to go to Barak, you would think that Deborah would just go ahead and sing the song. She is, after all, the judge and the commander-in-chief. No. She shares the limelight. She shares that honor with Barak. And the 2 of them sing together. And the heroine in their song is actually Jael. I can't think of a more amazing picture of corporate leadership. Deborah's not full of herself. She shares the stage with Barak, but Barak is also humbled by this point, and the 2 of them sing of the great exploits of Jael. And actually, the enemy, I think, is not even mentioned by name. I forget if it's Sisera or Jabin. He's not even in the song. So that just gives you an idea of who God prioritizes.